So welcome everybody to the NHS Flow Ideas Exchange. This was, so if people can put themselves on mute, that'd be great. This was born out of a conversation that myself and Mike Forster from Harrogate, following one of the Lent to Stay web conferences that we had, and I was asked whether we had a forum for people to have discussions such as we're going to try today. So this is the inaugural version of this. We have Mike Foster, who's an operations director from Harrogate and District NHS Foundation Trust, and Siobhan Molunder, who's head of clinical improvement at Mid and South Essex. And we're facilitating this through our team, the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team. The idea is that we have a conversation at a national level between peers. So to the extent that ESIS are supporting this, it is in a facilitation role. So today we're going through the unintended consequences of introducing a discharge to assess model in Harrogate. There's a question that Mike will pose about what happens when nursing homes keep turning you down. Siobhan will show us through a brief presentation on her Safer Scorecard. I'll hand you over to Mike, who's going to make a very short presentation on supportive discharge. Over to you, Mike.
Okay. I suppose I don't know, in terms of navigating through the slides, the first slide is just about how we create a bit of a call to action to our organisation. And it's really just simply modelling through, based on current length of stay and non-elective activity growth projections, what would be our bed requirements over the coming years. And basically just as a range from sort of a maximum to minimum beds required, with a line across the middle being the number of beds we had. And I think we're trying to create a narrative to the trust that actually sort of said, we have a very fixed bed base at Harrogate, and if we did nothing by sort of 2023, we would have well outstripped our bed base. So we needed to do something different. And it's the worst option was to have to build more wards and to try and employ more nurses and doctors where we know we have problems and where we already have big agency costs. So that was a call to action. This is Pinching with Pride. This was nicked from South Warwickshire, and we were trying to just come up with a really simple pictorial version of discharge to assess. And there's the three pathways. So pathway 3 being the most complex people who are going to go on to need ongoing care. Pathway 2 being people that required inpatient rehabilitation. And pathway 1 being people whose needs could be met at home with support. So we described that. We were trying to think that actually, when we looked at these pathways, when we found is the capacity in each of them was just a bit of an accident of history. So like pathway 2, which is our intermediate care beds, we had 16 beds in Ripon and 20 beds down in Harrogate, just because that's the facilities that we historically had and the number of beds that were in them. It wasn't based on any analysis of what you needed in each pathway. I think the next slide on is basically when we looked at our reasons for delays historically, one of the biggest reasons for delays was a wait for intermediate care beds. And I think when you looked at that in terms of occupied bed days lost at the hospital, the solution that we'd originally started thinking about is that we needed more intermediate care beds. And in fact, over previous winters, we'd gone out and bought more intermediate care beds. And with the consequence, most patients actually stay quite a long time after winter. So we got a sort of a one-off hit moving people into these facilities, but found that actually they had extended lengths of stay. And after you've had that one-off benefit, a lot of those patients were in those facilities for quite a long time. And where we got to in our thinking was actually, we're probably, the pathway we needed to focus on was really pathway 1, about patients being placed in their own homes. And what we found is when we did an audit of our pathway 2 and patients in bed, was a lot of those were in the beds because that was where the capacity had been. It was a pathway that people in hospital found really easy to understand. You know, moving them into a bed somewhere else seemed like a really easy pathway for nurses and doctors on the wards to understand. So we had a lot of people queuing there. But when we looked at what was queuing and what was in there, actually with more capacity in homes, we felt actually we could probably manage more more of those in their own home. So we took the approach of, rather than buying more intermediate care beds, what we would do is build capacity in pathway 1 to get people home with support, and then reassess what the capacity for intermediate care beds needed to be. So the next slide is basically, we did a couple of perfect weeks, and we called them Every Hour Matters in the hospital, just as our strap line. And when we did that, some of our community therapists came forward and they sort of said, we think there's patients on your wards and awaiting your intermediate care beds that we could manage at home if we had a bit more resource. And what we want to do is we want to trial it, and they trialed it over winter. And over a period of time, when we're looking at what they're pulling out of the hospital and managing in their own home, it was about sort of 5 beds per day's worth that they were picking up on. And they had a whole lot of unmet demand. They sort of said, if we had more resource, we feel we could pull a whole lot more out there. So we managed to build a case to the Trust Board on the back of sort of saying, actually, if we don't address this, we're going to have to build more wards. We use loads of escalation beds in the past. We've spent loads of money buying intermediate care beds in the community. Why don't we try and invest in this community team that are really enthusiastic about pulling people at home? We managed to get a business case for what we determined as being 15 virtual beds in the community, and we got the board to basically approve it on the basis of reducing the requirement for escalation and the money that we'd spent on escalation beds historically. So the next slide is this is just the criteria that they came up with. So basically they basically had their 15-bedded virtual ward, and they split it up to 5 sort of shorter stay beds, and they worked out how many patients they'd need to pull from the hospital each week to fill those beds. And obviously they're higher turnover. They had sort of 5 medium stay beds where they had a longer period of input. So this is how long those patients would stay in the virtual beds to stay on their caseload. And they had 5 which were much longer stay, up to 20-day length of stay and input there. So what we found by doing that is when we put that team in, we saw a massive reduction in the number of occupied bed days in our acute bed base awaiting pathway 2, so awaiting inpatient beds. And it was because actually they hadn't really required inpatient care. It was because they were put into that pathway because that's where the capacity was, and it was a pathway that was easy to understand. And actually, when we started moving people into the community, the queues and waits for our intermediate care beds became significantly less. So the 2 charts are there of the number of occupied bed days wasted in hospital waiting for intermediate care beds, and then our overall DTOC position next to it. So I suppose the last slide was just looking at the DTOC data. The solution we would have jumped to and did jump to was to open more intermediate care beds. And actually what we found is, in reality, a lot of people have been moved into that bedded facility just due to lack of other alternatives and getting people to the right place first time, and building capacity to able to manage those patients safely at home actually was what really needed to do. I suppose my question was, and the reason I got in touch with Charlie was we were having problems when we were doing our long stay meetings with a number of patients where we were going around and so these patients are being refused by multiple care homes. It's quite interesting, since I had that discussion with Charlie, one of the patients, I was trying to think of solutions about how do we incentivize a care home to take them, and it was for an interim. And they'd been assessed by 7 care homes in the end. And when I started saying, look, can we go back to the start of this patient's journey, I found that the original plan for this patient, who had very difficult behaviours, was to get them home. And on that long stay meeting, somebody from the supported discharge, which is this community resource we built, was with me. And they sort of said, well, why have we moved away from that plan? And the worry was that they're so disruptive in hospital that they'd never be able to cope at home. And what she did is she linked in with the council, the voluntary group, the person's partner, and basically tried to put a package around that individual. She took a real coordinating function, and we actually got that person home rather than get them to a care home. I have to admit, when she got home, she broke all her windows and the neighbours called the police. However, with some real support, she's still there now, 4 weeks later. They were sitting down with her the other day, and she was saying things like, I've got my team around me, I've got my team to support me. And they said she's starting to emerge as the person she once was. Now she's back in her own environment. So it made me think, actually, sometimes I'm probably guilty of, you get caught up and fixated on a pathway. And that one was one where I actually turned around. But I still have a question, which is, when you find people being turned down by multiple care homes because of their behaviour, I was interested in people's strategies and approaches, different approaches to trying to tackle that.
So a couple of things there. So thank you very much for the presentation. I think the data is really powerful, and I'll be using that locally. I've got a few trusts who still aren't doing discharge to assess. So I think that's a really good presentation from that point of view. So the question that you're posing to everybody else, and because we are such a small team this morning, I think anybody can chip in on this point, but if we would like to hear from your peers first, is what do you think is the best way to manage care homes, particularly in the situation where you've had multiple care homes with patients, and it's the then what next step? If you want to raise your hand, or you can always type a question into the chat room. So, Siobhan, what's your advice, do you think?
I mean, for me, it's an early escalation to CCGs really for support. So beyond about once we get about 2 refusals, we would then speak to our CCG colleagues and try and get them to mediate between ourselves, and then maybe go out and look for specific nursing homes that might actually be able to meet the needs of those patients. So rather than waiting for 5 to refuse, we step in a little bit earlier and use our relationships to try and get people to support that process. And also our trusted successor, we've that role is a system funded role, so it's funded by the CCG and the County Council. She now works, she's got relationships with about 40 of our local nursing homes, who all allow her to do assessments on their behalf. So we're getting a lot less refusals now than we did, I guess.
Can I pose this question to everybody, just because it came up as an experience in York Teaching Hospital when I was there recently. They've got really good practice where on their wards, they make sure no nursing home assessment is done, i.e. no nursing home comes in without being met at the front door, without then being guided through the notes and the discussion. And I think too often you get places where nursing homes have been but haven't spoken to anybody. So because I was quite impressed when I was talking to Mike about this, there is something about the management of the expectations of nursing homes right from the outset and not getting into that trouble. And I think I was at Scarborough last week, and just because one nurse had noted the patient had thrown a potato at them, that became a whole violence issue, and that you had to do a behaviour chart, etc. So there's a bigger piece there around that discharge planning. But then when you get into trouble, that early escalation, is that a fair summary?
I agree. It's and very often, well, we've had it in our organisation just this week. A patient swore at the person from the home, without even speaking to a member of staff. But as you say, if the team had met the home at the door and explained a little bit more about how the patient can present, and then that could have been resolved.
It's an interesting one, because in terms of the long length of stay review methodology, we're always saying a lot of these issues are internal delays or internally driven, and it's interesting how I almost want to be careful what I say here, but everybody's too busy, and they're always too busy to do something, and yet there are some really key bits that you just have to do because it saves you a lot of trouble in the longer term.
Charlie, can I just come in here? So I have had similar problems at one of the sites I've been working at, and there's been a lot of discussion on these sites about how the ward itself manages risk and how that is perceived by the assessing nursing homes. So for example, if somebody is a risk of falls, they're put into a cohorted bay, and that is taken as they need one-to-one. And actually it's not, it's just that's how the ward, a ward environment is very different to a home environment and very different to a care home environment. And I think it's something about how we translate those risks into the care home settings. But also I think with that, it's that, when people move out of hospitals, that the care homes are not abandoned, and actually how we support, how can we support that prevents somebody being readmitted, if they take that risk, what can we do at pace to support those staff to ensure, because confusion, we all know, once you're in a more stable environment that hasn't got the hustle and bustle of a ward, can actually change very rapidly when the environment's much calmer and feels more familiar and feels, it's just very different. So to me, that's kind of like my reflections about how we manage risk within the ward and the impact of that on the assessments.
I'll bring some other people in shortly, but there's a message just come up on the group chat, which is, so it's Jill from York who's sent the message via the chat. The Mental Health Trust has started to trial placements and give assurances that if after a week they will either take the patient back or place elsewhere. So actually there is something about that risk management and how you can overcome some of that risk issues, because they are private businesses and they have to manage their own risks, and maybe if we find a way of working with them in terms of that your money back guarantee type thing, it seems not an unhelpful way of tackling the issue. So Callum, who's one of our therapists at ESIST, the root issue is that people with behaviour will behave differently in a hospital environment rather than their own home. Judging them in that environment will generally make the staff believe that they need more care and support. People with dementia and communication impairments will use behaviour to try and gain attention to the fact that they're not happy and can't. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it was something that you said, Mike. Actually, technically, there is no patient you can't do home first, which is exactly what you were forced into with that individual. And they did have behavioural issues and they destroyed their own property to begin with. But actually, they did normalise and settle down and they're still at home. So I think Callum's point there is also well made, is that maybe home first, even before going to nursing home, might be probably something we should think about for all patients, not just for the most difficult to place. It's a question mark, isn't it? Any last questions to Mike or any last suggestions? And if not, we'll move swiftly over to Siobhan.
Can I just ask Mike, I couldn't see from it's Jill speaking in Wiltshire, couldn't see from the slides. After you've had the supported discharge service and the patients have gone home, do you have a duration of your anticipated time that you'd spend with them? At what point, who do you hand over to if they do need ongoing care and support?
Yeah, so we tried to sort of break it up into sort of three pathways. So short stay, medium stay, long stay. So we originally did it with sort of much shorter interventions. So, and then try to build it up. So we started with sort of like a couple of days. And we accepted that you need to turn around a lot of those patients with very short support. Then as we built capacity, we sort of said we'd take up to sort of 7 days support. And then eventually we had an offer that was up to 20-day support. And we were trying to get the team to think about, because obviously that takes different capacity depending. So the more 20-day patients they took, obviously that would soak up more of their bed capacity. So we tried to think of it in terms of like it being a ward and sort of thinking about that you needed to still move people on, and they had 3 different offers effectively. So it has sort of developed over time. We've now linked the community geriatrician in with the team. So what they're finding now is that they can discharge people home and then link in with the community geriatrician. So there's things like medication reviews or falls reviews, they can link in and get outpatient appointments and have conversations with the community. It's developed a little bit, but it started with very short term. The good links with reablement, it's a bit about not keeping people on your books and having clear handovers. So the reablement team and the council would treat them as if they're on a ward. So their assessment time periods are the same as if they're on a ward, not as if they're in a community service. So we had to get the broader system to still consider that these people are effectively in a virtual bed, and that was the way we can try and maintain flow. We used to have a fast response team, and what we found is their capacity got sucked up because they couldn't discharge people off their caseload. This team have been much more effective at working with reablement, living well, and our community teams to make sure that they're still discharging from their virtual beds, and that's why it's worked a bit better. It's worked better this time.
Thank you very much for that. So Siobhan, if we move over to you at the end of the presentations, or at the end of the discussion, we'll just have a quick debrief for those people who can hang around, and we'll take it from there. But over to you, Siobhan.
Hi, so I've got Chris Spellman here from PA Consulting, who's been working with us recently on some of our patient flow improvement program.
Oh yeah.
So we have probably been I've been working on the clinical improvement stuff for probably about 2 years now. We've had some real success at MID around the super stranded reviews. Lots of support from ESIS. So we've had Lisa and the team in following the catering model, and we've managed to get from our baseline of 72 patients down to 50 to 55 at the moment. So one of the sites that met our 40% reduction that was required. We have then started trying to look at some improvements internally, really, about how we deliver some of our internal processes around safer board round compliance. So working with the team, we set up a bit of a safer sponsorship program for the wards. Just recognizing, I guess, that we have limited resource. I have a couple of people that work with me and my team, and the PA guys, there's probably 2 of you at the moment, possibly 3 heading into next week. So a limited resource. So what we've done is got our senior leadership team to support. So we've allocated all 17 inpatient wards to a senior leader in the organization. We've really been clear about the expectation of what that entails. So the expectation in normal amber and green is that they would be out on their wards at least twice a week doing a board round with the teams, around building up the relationships, being that go-to person in the leadership team that our guys can kind of refer things to when they're really stuck on the bigger constraints. And just the delivery of safer, and we have a teletracking system in place across the 3 sites in Mid and South Essex. So Basildon, Southend and Mid have been using teletracking for a year to try and track our patient flow and do the improvements around getting patients out a little bit earlier in the day and knowing where we are with our bed management. So the compliance around that is one of the big drives, but also compliance around the safer patient flow bundle. You can see on this first slide, so the top bit is some of the compliance we get daily through a heat map around how well people are doing with the pending and confirmed discharges. So what we need our wards to be is I think 70% and above on the pending and 80% and above on confirmed compliance every day, because that means our off-site hub, which is at Billericay, can allocate patients appropriately into the right beds first time if they know what discharges are coming up, and we can have a bit of a planned approach to how we allocate our beds. We're, I suppose, a long way off getting that right yet, but this last 3 weeks of our improvement program has really seen a big increase in the amount of compliance around teletracking. What we also decided to do then was try and look at the best practice NHS guidelines around board round processes, and we've drawn together kind of a tool that allows us to measure how well we're doing with our board rounds. And it looks at everything around team, action focus, the fundamentals of a board round, whether we're planning today for tomorrow, those kind of things. So even around the detail of attendance, who comes, do they turn up on time? So our sponsors take this to the wards and they score the wards out of 25. And as you can see, the fundamentals on one side, so are the right people there? Are we starting on time? So that's just your basic process. Then are we sharing best practice in the one team score? Does everybody get to contribute? Is it an inclusive MDT approach so that everybody has a valued opinion? Our action focus around the main things within the bundle. So have EDDs been set? Are they reviewed and talked about on each patient every day? Do we talk about patients who aren't medically fit and start planning their discharge early enough? Our actions owned, and that being really clear on the board rounds. And again, looking at those flow enablers around use of the discharge lounge, TTOs, is the teletracking up to date for the board round, and do we allocate somebody on that board round to keep it up to date? And then some suggested questions, because not all of our sponsors are clinical. So some of them will be, we have our Director of Finance out, for instance, and our Director of HR. So it's just giving them some prompts around the kind of things they would pick up. So the expectation is we get 2 of these scorecards back a week. If we're on incident, then the expectation is that they would be there every day. And each time they go to a board round, we would want them to bring back one of these scorecards to us. And then I guess Chris can pick up the rhythm stuff and how we collect this data, what we do with it.
Yeah, so as Siobhan said, the sponsor's role is to essentially go to the board, observe, but then also provide in the moment feedback around what they've seen and heard, and how that kind of that board round's been delivered. They then bring back that scorecard to us, which essentially gives us a kind of qualitative assessment of what's going on that ward. What we've also developed with the team here is some quantitative analysis. So each week a patient flow dashboard is generated, which has we've really slimmed down to 5 or 6 really key metrics. So at a ward level, they get their discharge profile across the week, so by day of the week, but then also time of the day bucketed down according to best practice. And then they get length of stay, trend analysis, stranded numbers, super stranded numbers, and then their teletracking compliance. So that means that that's given to the ward manager as well as the sponsor. So the expectation is that at the Monday morning board round, they will have a conversation looking back at the last 7 days of that data and talking about celebrating success from the week, and also identifying any kind of issues. Anything that they can resolve themselves, then you would expect actually the team on the ward to do that, but also then they've got the sponsor connection to actually escalate up. So they're the kind of 2 inputs that Siobhan and I have as the program team. We then look at all of the data in the round, the teletracking compliance and the flow metrics, and we also provide some kind of like personalised messaging to the sponsors, so that when they're dropping into the ward, we might say for them, and actually the scorecard that the compliance data you saw in the last slide is quite a good example of it really dropping off on some of the weekends, which would suggest you've got a resilience issue in terms of whether people understand what the expectation is of them over the weekend in relation to teletracking. So we'll pick out some of those key messages, and then Siobhan will actually kind of speak or send a direct message to each of the sponsors. So they've got that kind of continual feedback loop of we've seen what we've seen for a week. Now we're going to do a little focused cycle of improvement. Siobhan and I will listen to the feedback of these guys. In fact, Friday afternoon is the day that all of these come back into Siobhan and I. We then do a little wrap up action planning session for the following week. So based on what we've seen and heard and what the numbers are telling us, what are our 3 or 4 target areas for next week that we as a program team are going to actually go and directly support? So then we'll plan to go and engage directly on the ground with those wards, addressing the issues that the sponsors have fed back. And then the only other element that might be worth touching on is inevitably not all of the wards are at the same level, and actually some of them are really quite already high performing, both in relation to their kind of delivery of the safer bundle, but also in their use of the teletracking system. So for those wards, actually, this kind of level of support and engagement wouldn't have been as useful. So we've got a kind of fast track program where the 4 wards that we've picked out are really kind of moving on to the next level of sophistication in relation to the use of the teletracking system in particular. And what's been great about that, I think, is there's a really strong kind of like peer-to-peer learning element, both within that fast track group, but that's now also being played back to those other wards. So halfway through the program, we're using those guys to now sort of show what's possible on the wards that are just getting up to that kind of basic level of compliance. So that kind of sustainability and sharing the best practice on the ground, I think has been really, really positive.
And I suppose from my point of view, it's the ability to measure a board round, and that's nothing I've had before, I suppose, within MID. So it's been really great to be able to play this back after you. So I'm a sponsor of one of the wards myself, and just to sit with a ward sister following a board round and really quantify what's good and what's really not good, and what we might need to do a bit of work on. For an example, one of our surgical board rounds was at 10 o'clock in the morning, very poor attendance, sat in a room with the therapists and the nurses, and it was a bit lame. So we've gone from that in a week to out by the board, in the middle of the ward, on the teletracking board with the team there at 9 o'clock, really focused, 20-minute action-focused board round, which we've done consistently now for all this week, and it's beginning to really just embed. And they're actually, the whole team are kind of saying, well, I don't know why we didn't do this before. So I suppose the role of the sponsor really being that enabler of the bit about permission that we find often in acute trusts, where people are waiting for permission to do change. I think our teams the sponsors are going to be able to give them the ability to just get on and try things, and that's been really helpful over the past couple of weeks. So I suppose we're absolutely proud to share this. So we're going to put it on Twitter directly after this chat today. We did want to hold it back just till we'd had this share today. Happy for people to use it. And it's just a really good collaboration between us and PA around trying to drive some of this improvement in a really focused way.
Thank you very much for that. We'll take some questions in a second. I think what's great about it is you've given, even for a matron, for example, I've seen matrons be on board rounds, and you wonder to what extent they are any better at board rounds than anybody else. But what you've done here is given those non-clinical people and everybody a structure and a reason for being on the board round. So I open up to any questions around the scorecard and that piece of work to Jill and Mike in the first instance. So any question from you guys or any reflections?
No, I'd be really interested in having it. I think one of the things we have is inconsistency of board rounds, and I think they've all developed slightly differently. The good thing is they've carried on all our wards, but I think some of the ones in the elderly care wards have turned back into MDTs, and they go on forever, and the junior doctors can't escape. And actually, sometimes I'm thinking maybe this is having a negative impact because an hour and a half later, everybody's still boards. I think having the structure to it like this is a really good idea. So I'd be really interested to have a look at that. The only bit I saw in yours about this discharge lounge mentioned, I have had no success with encouraging my wards to use discharge lounges.
Same. It hasn't worked yet.
I was trying to think, how do you incentivize wards to use discharge lounges? And I've tried a bit of everything, and I was trying to think what tasks do nurses really hate doing that a discharge lounge could do for them, but I'm still not having a lot of success. So that'd be another question to Bravo, who is successful at getting people to use their discharge lounges, because it feels like sometimes it feels better per resource than some of our wards. And
well, we've started. I mean, we're definitely not as compliant as we could be yet, but we're certainly, because we have the teletracking system again, we know our confirmed discharges and where they are. So the discharge lounge staff are actively trying to pull those patients. And we have a new Band 7 lead for our discharge lounge. She will often go out and do some clinical assessment. So if wards are saying, oh, the patient can't go to the discharge lounge, Lisa will go and she'll do an assessment on that patient. She'll then almost challenge that kind of cultural piece around, because they have mild dementia, they can't go to the discharge lounge. Actually, this isn't going to have an impact negatively on the patient. They can absolutely go to the discharge. And our staffing is probably the highest skill mix in the hospital within that tiny area. And it just gets so underused. So I think we're at the beginning of that journey. And again, with the PA guys, we're going to start looking at some of that next week about how we generate some more use of it. I went to see the West Suffolk, who have an absolutely awesome discharge lounge. I think something like 2/3 of her discharges go through her lounge, and it's run by a Band 4, interestingly, who used to be their transport coordinator and now runs their discharge lounge. And she's very clear that the nurses that work in there work for her, and they get, they just go and do their nursing jobs that they need to do, but she actually coordinates the ward flow. And again, her HCAs spend no time in the lounge. They're just out pulling patients all the time down to the lounge. So they will go and get people up, dressed and ready and take them. So again, it's that bonus for the ward that they're not having to pack people up and get them ready. So West Suffolk is an example I would suggest anyone go and see. It's a really interesting discharge lounge model.
That's good, thank you.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I was having a conversation yesterday about this at another workshop we were running, and AMUs, for example, form the function of a standardized admission process in a lot of cases. And yet we haven't really designed what that back end function is of a discharge lounge. And it sounds like, Siobhan, just you were talking about, they're at least pulling that activity into it. Yeah. I think the key bit, and I think you started to touch on it, Mike, it's okay, it's not just a room by which patients exit the hospital. It's not just a storage place for patients, but actually what else does it need to be to make it add value and do something positive apart from just increasing flow? Because that's the catch perhaps for hooking nursing staff, etc.
Now, I was going to say discharge lounges have been an old debate, and obviously I know SAFER pretty well, having been involved with it for a while. I think discharge lounges only work, I know the West Suffolk team, it works if there's a real purpose to them. and it doesn't disrupt the patient's journey. I mean, in theory, there's an argument whether you need a discharge lounge at all if you get all the other stuff right, adding an extra step in. But this would be my take of the discharge lounge. Unless it improves your discharges before midday by at least 25%, that's the time the patient leaves the ward as a minimum, preferably 33%, it's not worth the money, if I'm being honest with you. That's quite an opinionated statement, but you can prove it works, but it needs to be the way it works every day. It can't be it's open one day and not open the next day, because anyone who's worked on the ward, which I did 100 years ago, you just lose confidence in it. But actually, it almost has to be. One of the things at West Suffolk, which is great, is they have a fantastic leader in Steve Dunn, their chief executive. He sets the pace, he walks the walk, everyone knows this is what's expected. So I'd say you either have a discharge lounge and use it, or you don't. But every ward, when they're doing safe, what I really like about this is you're starting to measure it, should have a knowing how you're doing board. Quick question to the guys there. Does this go on you knowing how you're doing board, guys?
So the coloured copy is left on the board and the photocopy comes back to us. So all the sponsors are asked to fill it out with the ward, talk it through with the ward sister or whoever's in charge on the day, leave the nice, beautiful copy with them, and then bring us back a photocopy so we can keep a track of it. It also measures compliance around people actually getting out to their board rounds. So it gives us a bit of a monitoring tool for our sponsors to make sure that they're actually going out there and getting on with what we need them to do, which is fabulous.
We've got a naughty list this week.
Yeah.
Do you? Why do your doctors react to it? So your consultants and your other senior decision makers, how do they react to it?
I mean, on our medical wards, our medical compliance on board rounds, we have good board round processes in place. So they think it's quite a useful tool, because again, they're getting the feedback at the end of the board round the same as we are. We're giving the team.
I think it's the point that we were making earlier about the tendency for some board rounds to turn into ward rounds, and actually when you're being measured about, did we roughly spend a minute on each patient, the consequence of starting to embed this way of working is that generally you end up with a much shorter board round, which doctors tend to like. So if you get this kind of action focus embedded, I think that's the major benefit they see.
So just going back to Pete's opinionated point as well on the discharge lounge, because I think that's quite useful. It's a bit of a realisation, but I think I am familiar with the debate about whether to have a discharge lounge or not. But I think the point you made there, which is really important not to miss and just to reinforce, is it's not worth the additional cost if patients are just going to go home at 7 o'clock at night, as they would have done anyway from a ward, because actually part of these things that you're putting in and incurring extra costs for is to stop you tipping over in the first place.
I was just going to make the point, I don't have a great opinion on discharge lounges, but I do have an opinion on Charlie's point there, which is the main point. What are we trying to do? We want to squeeze patients' time, not rush them out. So I don't actually, I've been asked by so many chief execs, are discharge lounges good or bad, Pete? And I go, I don't really know, but I guess this is the purpose of them. Yeah.
So we're doing a lot of work in our board rounds at the moment. And my question was, has anyone managed to get surgeons to be present on board rounds? So I have great compliance on all of our medical wards, medical attendants everywhere, juniors and consultants. But one particular surgical ward, I probably have maybe about 8 or 9 surgeons who work on that ward. They all come in between about 8 in the morning and 9, do their rounds, and they're gone to theatre. So we haven't found a solution to get them to be present on board rounds.
So before Pete comes in, can we just go to just to the peers first? If we go to the peers first, that'd be great. So Mike, what's the story in Harrogate, for example?
Probably similar, to be honest. I think the problem we have with us, because we're a small hospital, we have on the surgical wards especially, we have multiple ward rounds happening. So it's quite difficult to run that board approach when you have multiple teams on there. On the medical wards, it works better because it's predominantly a firm linked with the wards, so there's less. So I don't know, we haven't got it great. The surgeons want to get in early, get off to theatre, and you have multiple teams. So same problems actually. We'll struggle with the engagement.
No problem. And what about either of the Jills? If I presume one might assume that you're having the same problem, which is where Pete, I think, will give us advice, because I think I probably know what Pete might be about to.
Actually, Charlie, I was going to say one of the best examples involved you, actually.
Me? Oh, right.
Yeah, well, it actually involved you in one of the BHR hospitals. It was a urology ward. So I was going to say, actually, I wasn't going to answer the question. I do have an opinion about it, but which is no surprise. But I was going to say, your experience there, Charlie, that was the ward manager I met. She was raving about you. She almost didn't want to see me. She wanted to see Charlie. So something you'd done on that surgical ward had worked. I was just wondering what it was.
So here was the key to that. And it was interesting. I was talking to Jyoti yesterday, or a couple of days ago, and I was talking to one of our acute physicians, Nick Roper, about frailty. And the point he was making is, actually, it's not our care of the elderly physicians who are leading on frailty in our organisations. It's other people from other specialty, because that frailty lead role is very different from who's actually providing the frailty service. And I think the same thing, in a sense, was happening. It was a urology surgical ward at BHRUT, and none of the surgeons wanted to participate in the programme at all. But he was really keen because he got it. And what we had done, not in quite, well, I think yours is more sophisticated than what I had done, but we had given them a way of measuring whether the other consultants were doing what he thought was right. And then, because he was the leader, he was leading on the matter, he then went and tackled them individually. So giving him the evidence that people weren't doing what they said they were doing, or what they believed they were doing, was the key bit. So this bit about collecting some form of measurable data that can be used by people in a leadership role to influence their colleagues, I think, was the key matter. Not to mention that Sinead was fantastic in terms of, again, her leadership.
Yeah, all I was going to say with surgeons, I mean, remember, so SAFER was created as a broad set of principles. It never said, thou shalt have a board round. In fact, the version before SAFER did. It was called the bed bundle, and it said board round and here. What we found out when we first started it, and we were testing it before I was in Exist, actually, was actually the key thing was, did the person see a senior person? So if you're really on a busy ward with 8 consultants, I don't know if any of you worked in a surgical ward, you can't really get them all to do a board round because they tend to be really busy. It's not that they're slacking there, but they have stuff to do, either to get to outpatients or get to theatres. So if they're getting the senior review and writing a really clear plan, that is good enough. But if you just say, I'll tell you what, if you want to disengage a group of surgeons, it's a really good way to do it. As long as they're doing the senior review, I probably think you're probably getting from that part of the bundle enough.
Yeah, I'll come back to that in a second, Pete, because I'll just feed in what the 2 Jills have said. So same in York, surgeons do rounds early and then off to surgery. And then Jill Whittington was saying, as a community trust, the community wards are primarily nurse and GP led. We expect a lead nurse to be present, but not the GP. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Pete. If you try and condense the one thing that you want to happen at the end of the board round, it's agreeing that we know what's going to happen today to a patient, because that allows you to then review that later. There's lots of board rounds that do lots of other stuff, but they miss that crucial point. So in your analogy there, Pete, if they've had some sort of surgical review and the people on the board round can say what that is and what's happening next, you've absolutely nailed it. So on that note, just to say thank you to the 2 Jills. I do think if we didn't have somebody who wasn't part of the team and not one of the speakers, I might have bottled it. But really good. Thank you for them. And thank you very much to Mike and to Siobhan for their stuff. Actually, I think we've had some really good, interesting stuff there to be sharing. So I really appreciate it.